All right, Sydney, can you hear and see us?
Yes. How about vice versa?
Beautiful. We're in.
Wonderful.
We
Good.
are.
Just in time to talk about Taylor Swift's engagement news. This is great. I'm
This is
happy to be
this is what
here.
the topic's about, everybody.
Yeah.
This-
I can't stop thinking about it, so I'm really glad we could all discuss our feelings
what do you
today.
think about the ring? That's a nice ring.
Oh, everything was perfect. I'm like so legitimately happy. I can't get over myself. I know, I
She's not her
know, I know
person.
I don't know them, but I love them.
But we do know them though. We do know them. And they know us. I'd like to think Taylor cares a lot about climate risk disclosure, and she's actually here today. So
Or she does.
yeah, no, this is really matters. I think this Asheen Finsey name, this attendee here is actually Taylor Swift in disguise. Maybe it's Danny Brown. Maybe it's Danny Brown as Taylor Swift, maybe. Um, all right, perfect, everybody. It is 2:03. We can get going. Surprise, surprise, we will not be talking about Taylor Swift, unfortunately. Maybe a little bit, maybe a little bit. We'll see how the conversation goes. But I am super glad you're all here. I'm very excited to welcome Sydney Vergis from California Air and Resources Board, who's been doing a ton of work. And you're like a bit of a climate celebrity at the moment, Sydney. Know it or not, admit it or not, you are in the conversation here. Um,
Are me flattered. That's amazing.
there we go. Let's see if you hold up to the expectations here. The way we're going to run this is mostly Q&A. I really encourage everybody on here to ask questions. So the chat is open, the Q&A is open. I'm going to ask one thing about these questions. Sydney's not your lawyer, and she's not your emotional support friend. You could ask questions about the direction of these laws, the creation of these laws, but she is not going to tell you if your company needs to comply with these laws. So let's try to keep those questions to a minimum. I'll filter some of those out. Um, Sydney, I really appreciate you joining. And for this conversation, this is really timely. There's 4 months left or so until the first compliance deadline. We'll mostly be talking about SB 261 today, with a little bit of 253 to come along. But I want to start a conversation by going back to like when these laws came on your radar for the first time. What is the process of a law leaving the governor's desk as a signature and making its way to CARB for enforcement look like? When did that happen, and what were those first few steps?
It's a great question. So, of course, we take our direction from the legislature, and we're very happy to be handed, this package of legislation, which I think will be really important for consumers and investors. And certainly, we're hearing that feedback. There's kind of two things that happen in parallel, some of which is a me problem, and some of which is an everybody else problem. But it's a good problem to have in that this legislation also came with resources, which isn't always the case. So I've been in the fortunate position of being able to build up the team pretty substantially. So we have a whole new branch that's dedicated to developing and implementing these pieces of legislation. And so, part of ramping up the program has been the hiring process. So we've got a great branch chief on board. We've got some great managers. We've got some great staff, and more to come. So we've been ramping up that, and we've also been ramping up our internal knowledge of these types of programs. This was a new kind of arena for us. We usually were known for, I would say, pretty strong regulations on like mobile sources or stationary sources, and so a lot of those companies, we know pretty well and they know us pretty well. But this legislation has brought in thousands of new friends. And so we've been trying to build up our internal knowledge about how these different businesses work, and how to engage with a new set of stakeholders on how to implement these regulations in the most streamlined way possible. So it's been a lot of learning and a lot of ramping up. So really grateful for the opportunity today and opportunity to get to know more folks
Yeah.
better. Yeah,
Uh, everyone's got questions, so that's good. Um, I
good.
feel like the nuts and bolts of like these rules getting crafted. So there's so many details that have to get figured out. I mean, if you take that original SB 261 law that was signed, let alone an SB 219 amendment that came after it, there's a lot of questions. Like, and you guys have been discussing what is $500 million in revenue? What is doing business in California? What is TCFD aligned? Like these are all questions that seem fairly obvious. Like the law says the numbers and the law says doing
Uh,
business, but there's a lot of nuance within it. What are the conversations like? Like who's involved? How does the process of figuring out those details come to pass? Because I think a lot of people on this call who are invested in these laws and care a lot about this, they care a lot about like the outcome, obviously.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
also would help us all to understand these laws that impact all of our careers in many ways and all of our companies. How do they get crafted? Like, what are those discussions like, and who's involved?
Hmm. Great question. So CARB as an agency, we're a very, I would say, public facing agency in that we really look to conversations like these, but also our workshop processes, letters, one-on-one discussions to help develop, regulations and implementation guidance that makes sense and is as streamlined as possible. We're not the type of agency that kind of goes away and like, figures out the answers to everything and then, presents like, here's how we're doing it. We really rely on, stakeholder input to figure out, what makes the most sense. And that's where we're at now. We've put out some staff ideas to help define who's in and who's out of the program. I mean, there are these terms like the ones you mentioned that seemed, at least on its face, very straightforward, but have turned into not as straightforward as I guess I would have expected. Like the term revenue, what does it mean to have $5 million in revenue annually? Turns out revenue is not a straightforward
Yeah.
concept.
Depends how good your accountants are, is what it
Yeah,
means.
it really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm learning that talking to accountants is like kind of like talking to lawyers about the revenue concept. It's like on the one hand you could count it this way, on the other hand you could count it this way, and
What
we're
is
like,
a
okay,
dollar anyway, conceptually? What are we
totally.
living in? Yeah.
We just as society have decided what a dollar is. I don't.
We're talking pesos, like we can really get into the nitty gritty.
We could
So,
really
like,
get
so,
into
so, so engaging with them and saying, all right, like, let's
yeah.
all, are you're getting their feedback on what is 500 million in revenue? What do you think it is? What do you think it is? But eventually you need to say, not everyone's going to be happy here, that like, we're going to make a decision and like it or not, that's the decision.
Yeah, the rubber is about to hit the road, so we really are encouraging folks to come to us with ideas. The feedback that we're getting so far, I would say on these like very foundational definitional terms on things like revenue and doing business. I think what's being handed to us mostly is like, well, we don't think you have it exactly right. Like, okay, well, that's quite possible, but how would we refine it? And so usually our engagement on, building out these types of regulations, there's a lot more give and take. And I think companies just aren't used to working with us. So I totally believe that we probably don't have it exactly right, but what we're trying to pull in is, well, what would help us define these concepts such that it is very clear, to the regulated community about who's in and who's out. Like we need to know, you guys need to know, and so we really need help kind of refining these definitions. Particularly that, we're going into a pretty serious step in the rulemaking process over the next couple of months.
Yeah. Um, One of the pushbacks, I want to talk a bit about like what the pushbacks against these laws have been, because I think it's important to appreciate and understand. And one of them has been that I've heard from a bunch of people, does CARB, or let alone CARB, California even have the right to pass laws like these? Does California have the right to enforce disclosures such as these? And I'm curious from your perspective, um, and the reason I ask this now is because like one would hope that, not while some of these things are new and these specific types of disclosures might be new, that like it is based on a lot of case law and examples and defensible things. So like the fact that a dollar or $500 million or $1 billion is not like a defined thing, it gives some people concern. The fact that doing business in is not a defined thing, and I know there are conversations about, oh, can we tie it to that tax code? And maybe there's some similar laws of like 76,000 in receipts or whatever. But I'm curious in your conversations, or as much as you're able to share, how much of this is net new? Like really totally California believes that it needs to lead on this sort of totally new way of getting companies to disclose, versus how much of this is just an evolution of things California and CARB or other agencies have been enforcing for a long time.
Yeah, great question. Well, I think there's kind of two aspects to it. The legislature kind of, the way I think about it is gives us broad direction and then we refine that direction through the regulatory process. So on things like revenue definition and doing business in California, that's kind of all par for the course. They hand us this broad direction and we work with stakeholders to help refine it into something that, can be enforceable and where there's clarity about. how we're all moving forward together. But I think the good news is on your broader question when it comes to climate risk disclosures, or even scope 1 and 2, and to some extent 3 emissions reporting, is that California, as much as we like to claim to be a leader in all things, and of course we are as a native Californian, California is number one. Um,
As a
that there's
native New
so
Yorker, we can discuss that on a separate webinar.
um, is this our first fight?
This is earlier than I'd expect in the relationship, but also later than it usually takes for me to get in a fight with somebody. So we'll call this average.
Oh dear. Um, yeah, so I guess we'll table that for now. Um, I would say that there's so many other entities, at least, worldwide, that are already implementing this or something similar. And we're certainly hearing from a lot of companies that because of, other pressures or other interests, have been doing climate related financial risk disclosures or scope 1 and 2 emissions reporting already. So in some ways, what we're looking to do is try to make sure that our programs are streamlined and aligned with, common practices that folks are already participating in, and just trying to provide that level of information for, California stakeholders and investors.
And I remember the webinar you guys did 6 or 8 weeks ago. Somebody asked the question, hey, I'm like one remote employee in California.
Yeah.
My company might as well fire me so that they don't have to deal with this stuff. And so then in this more recent webinar, he said, well, maybe they're like some teleworkers. If all you have in California is teleworkers, maybe that's one way to exclude yourself. There's a challenge here because you are by nature forcing cross-border interstate commerce rules here. A Wisconsin company with a tiny little satellite office in California is now subject to these California regulations. Has that been a big theme of pushback? Like, is one of the major concerns that companies have, how dare California with their California ways force my Michigan, Wisconsin, Texas, Oklahoma company to do this? Like, have you had a lot of conversation about that?
Well, I think the benefit, at least of my position being on the program side and not the legal side, is that the folks I'm hearing from primarily are those that already do this kind of reporting. I mean, given these revenue thresholds, however we refine the definition, we're talking about, very large companies that are likely subject to their own stakeholder pressures. And what we're hearing mostly from companies is, hey, we're already doing, some type of this. And is there a way, to help make sure that California's program aligns with, current best practices. So that's been the majority of the conversations I've been having. And certainly, as part of the regulatory process, we do want to hear from folks about exemptions. That telework comment really, as you can tell, stuck with us and was like, okay, yes, if your only presence in California is the fact that somebody is working, in their office and aren't, with headquarters, which is way somewhere else, and headquarters way somewhere else does not have any business in California besides that teleworking employee. That does not seem to be the intent of the legislation here. So of course. And so as part of the conversation and the stakeholder process, we are interested in hearing those other types of examples. What other types of exemptions should we be considering?
Yeah. We're getting fairly late in the process here. One bit of pushback that I've heard a lot is this is so California. Pass a law, don't give clear guidance until the last minute, and kind of government's doing its thing, trying to overstep, overregulate, making all this confusing. I'm curious if you could just like shed light on how this process comes together, why it takes as long as it does to like come up with these definitions, and to the extent you're able to share, like, is it, I think the law passed in October or something, 2023, so it's been about 2 years. It would be about 2 years, 2 or 3 months until the first compliance deadline. Um, like, was it expected that specific guidance would not be released until the very end? Is that unexpected and sort of like this process was more difficult than we thought? I see a couple people here ask similar questions, which I'll get to in a second, but I think it part of that question that's being asked is like, teach us about the process. And my naive self would have been like, oh, the law is the rule and let's all just follow that. But clearly, like
Mm,
some of those rules are not going to be out until maybe even after January. For I don't know, like very close to
yeah.
our January 1st. Why is that, and what's that process
Well,
like?
I think for 261, it's been interesting because I think the law is quite clear. I mean, you've got a couple of frameworks that you can choose from in terms of developing your climate-related financial risk report. Has to be posted on a company's website by January 1. Most companies are doing it anyway. Maybe posting on the website is new. I'm not sure. And then, as part of the public outreach process, we have gotten asks for different guidance documents, and so we've been doing our best to, accommodate that as we've gotten those asks. So, I would say at the last workshop, one of the asks that came through loud and clear was, hey, like some companies aren't as far along in terms of their climate related financial risk reports as others. Some are already A+ students, some maybe not so. And so for those who aren't already A+ students, kind of what's the minimum that CARB is looking for in those reports? And we're like, okay, reasonable request. Let's put something together and get something out there. And so hence kind of what you saw at this last webinar where it was like, okay, here's kind of like a draft minimum checklist of the basics that CARB will be looking for. We also got feedback that some of the, I'll just say like optional items in TCFD and IFRS would be challenging for companies who aren't as far along as others. So there we did receive some asks to, please not include, climate scenario analysis, for example, as one of the mandatory things that CARB would absolutely be looking for. If a company didn't have it, or if they're building up expertise, for example, to develop that, please take a kind eye towards that, which was a very reasonable request, so that we also bake that into our minimum guidance. So as the process has continued, I would say we've gotten asked for, help, and which we've been happy to provide and happy to accommodate. And you see a lot of what we're doing to be in direct response to stakeholder comments.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it actually partially answers a little bit of the questions here around, Nico asked, when are you going to issue guidance about the bare minimum of acceptable reporting? And Erica said, like, how you judge the bare minimum, the best effort, because best effort leaves a lot of room for slackers. I will say very quickly on your note around, which is, respect, Erica. I will say very quickly on your note about the challenges of climate scenario analysis or being new to this. Uh, Fair aside, but check out Beehive Climate. We make all this stuff easy. Okay, back to our regular
Oh,
scheduled.
love that.
Um, Talk about the best effort, like, and I talk
Yeah.
about best effort in the context of, good faith effort, best effort. My assessment here is that if somebody puts out a report that says anything along the lines of our board reviews climate risks, management oversees this stuff, we did some sort of physical risk assessment and found nothing too material or some material things, and we're reviewing this further, you will say, okay, good start. Do better in 2 years, but you're not getting fined for that. You don't have to comment on that specific thing, but I'm curious, like, how do you expect to, are you going to be reading all? I used to read 10,000 companies were subject to this. Now I'm reading 5,000, whatever it is. Are you going to be reading all 5,000 reports and being like, good job, you get bonus credit versus nope, like you're in big trouble? Or is it you spot check them? Like, what is the actual even oversight? And I know you're hiring right now and whatever, like, what do you think that oversight looks like? Do you read everyone's homework or do you just check a couple people?
So yeah, there's a lot in there. So let me try to tackle as much as I can, and then if I miss something, you can keep me honest. So there's a
Like a
few
good
things there.
journalist, I asked 14 questions in one long
Yes,
paragraph, and you now have to remember all of them in order.
I can pick and choose. Yeah.
You're a good politician.
Exactly. We'll just choose what I want from there. No, I'm just kidding. I want to answer as much as possible. They're still hiding the ball here. Just building off your point that you're making a response to, I think it was Nicholas's comment. And when would CAR be, issuing our kind of bare minimum guidance or, draft checklist? I would say take a look at our workshop slides. From last week. You'll see that baked into the slides themselves. We are taking comments on it, just full disclosure. We worked off of the TCFD 2017. to try to establish what we thought kind of the bare minimum checklist would be there. So, looking for feedback as to whether or not we've got it right, that kind of thing. Um, Erica, loving your comment about leaving a lot of room for slackers and best effort. Definitely don't want slackers, but we're trying to define best effort, at least for this initial reporting requirement. And you'll see this, kind of echoed in our workshop slides and in our FAQ. What we mean by best effort is really, hey, use the best data that you have available to you for this first reporting requirement. For example, we have gotten some questions like, oh my gosh, I'm one person working in this large company, and the best available data I have for me is like fiscal year 23, 24. Am I going to get dinged for that? No, absolutely not. If that's the best available data you have, and that's what you have to work off of for this initial reporting period of January 1, 2026, that's what we mean by best effort. Use the best data that's available to you. So we've tried to be, clear in defining that for folks. And I think what the best data available is probably going to depend on, your company's particular situation and, that kind of thing. Try to figure out if there's how will we judge? Oh, how are we going to judge reports? Okay, so that is another reason why we're putting out this draft minimum checklist. Baked into the legislation is a requirement for CARB to look at these reports, and kind of put out summaries of what we're seeing to folks. So we're looking to act as a clearinghouse for these reports. But yes, we'll be going through them, getting the staff to do that, and are trying to figure out a way to compile the information to make it as useful as possible in an aggregated way for folks who are interested.
Yeah. So it sounds like part of this process, everyone's going to submit. Your portal opens up on December 1st. Folks put it up on the website by January 1st. By, I think, June 1st or something, your portal closes. So it gets submitted to your portal by June 1st. And in some period overlapping with that and then moving forward, your team is going to read every report that has been submitted and say, do we feel like this was a best effort or good faith effort or whatever we're saying? If somebody ends up in that slacker bucket, as Erica put it, do they automatically get issued a notice of penalty, or is it like, hey, please explain yourself a little bit better? Just want to know why you did what you did. What does that look like?
Yeah, we're a little bit, we do have enforcement authority as part of both of these bills. We do get a little bit cagey about how enforcement goes. We do have some level of discretion about how we navigate in those spaces that are usually context specific. So, um, yes, I mean, mostly I think we're looking to work with folks and I think are trying to recognize, and you'll see this in our guidance, that the program's ramping up and we have a lot of experience with how to ramp up programs. I mean, we've done this before with cap and trade, we've done it through mandatory reporting requirements. And so, we're trying to put out as much help as possible, to help make sure that folks like yourselves, who are interested in, trying to be good students, A+ students, can really meet the expectations that we're setting out there.
Yeah. I want to talk about that ramp up, but let's answer Caroline's question as well. She basically asked, she's heard conflict, and you kind of touched on this, but she's heard conflicting um, comments after last week's webinar about is scenario analysis
Mm,
required or not? And then when you are talking about financial disclosures, can they be qualitative or are they expected to be quantitative? So to
yeah.
the able, one more
So
time.
interesting. It's so funny because when I feel like being very clear, it's very interested to hear that we're not. So I'm interested to hear that like some of the summaries are coming up with different answers. Um, Bummer. So similar, yeah. So for the scenario analysis, where we've tried to land is recognizing that not all companies are in the same place. So if quantitative scenario analysis is available to you, if you have the data, the capacity, this is par for the course, and it's material to your analysis per the TCFD 2017 or later guidelines, um, and it's material, to your company's position, then absolutely include it. What we're trying to say is we're trying to recognize that not all companies are in that place. So if you need to do a qualitative analysis or qualitative description, absolutely understand that not all companies are going to be in the same place of being able to do a quantitative analysis, and that not all companies will find that doing a quantitative analysis is material to their specific position. So I guess we're trying to be clear in that we recognize that companies might be in different places on that, and that's okay.
I also think my answer to this, outside from the regulatory side of this, is the TCFD, remember, started as an investor-facing disclosure. Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, two powerful investors, said, we want more transparency around the companies we might invest into, their exposure to natural disasters and climate change. Please provide us that transparency. Now, if you write whatever you write, set aside CARB's opinion on it for a moment, but if you
Mhm.
publish whatever it is you publish and your investors don't care to see any more and they just are fine with the fact that you didn't do scenario analysis and you decided not to quantify, maybe you're fine. Like until CARB raises the bar, but like maybe you're fine because your investors actually don't care about that for whatever reason. But if they do ask you more questions and they say, thank you for this information, we would love to see you quantify this more. We would love to see the scenario analysis because it'll help us make better decisions. Then you have more insight that you should quantify it. Same thing to Erica's question, my perspective, call your lawyer and Sydney may disagree here. But if you want to be a slacker, great. Like go right ahead. Be a slack. Like feel free to phone it in and just write whatever you write. If you're let alone, set aside CARB's perspective on this for a moment. But if your investors are fine with that, then they're fine with it. Like, all right, great. You did whatever you needed to do to satisfy your investors' requests. If they have more questions and you can't satisfy their answers because the way you did your physical risk assessment was Google, do I have wildfire risk at my address? And Google said maybe. And so you said, I'm probably good. And that's what you explain to an investor, they might have an issue with that. So, like, again, CARB is one thing here, but TCFD, the framework is about investor transparency. So think for a moment, not just about are you going to get your wrist slapped by Sydney? She seems really nice, but maybe. But like, are your investors going to dig deeper into your results? And if you think they don't care, maybe they don't care. If you think they might care, then maybe up your quality a little bit. I won't make you comment on my specific framing of that, but any thoughts about like the investor lens of this regulation, which was like kind of how this whole thing started?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, clearly the intent of the legislation is for just that investor and, interested stakeholder transparency. So that's a great fundamental principle to keep coming back to.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the ramp up period because I want to talk about where this goes. The last, you know, I think last year, the first IFRS reports were due in Europe. They're due in Australia under ASB. Other countries like Brazil and Japan and Singapore have had similar reporting for a couple of years, but not forever. And a lot of both CSRD and Australia and California are really beginning to ramp up over the next couple of years. When you guys talk about where is this going to go, and what do we want out of this in the future, do you talk about this as a wow, wouldn't it be amazing to continue to up the quality of disclosure until it gets to the level of like 10K like financial disclosures? Do you talk about this as, oh, it's actually not the disclosure that matters. Hopefully, this just incentivizes people to care about natural disasters and adaptation measures? Like, where could this, what are the options of how this looks in 2, 4, 6 years?
Yeah, as a good little bureaucrat, what I keep coming back to is just the intent of the legislation. I mean, for us, that's really like what it all comes down to. Um, And so, for us, we're just trying to stay true to the intent of the legislation, which is all about transparency. I can't speak for, whether or not additional direction, comes down the pike later on, but that's how we're thinking about these programs, both in the near term and the long term.
Giving us a lot to golf there, Sydney.
Yeah, I know.
That's a fair answer. Somebody asked about the definition of revenue. We are not going to get into that at this point in time, but I think CARB is trying to be very, very clear um, about their intents here, so it's not perfect. But there's an interesting question from maybe the same anonymous attendee, maybe another, about the risk of over disclosing. You see this a lot in corporate sustainability departments where I know personally a bunch of companies that pulled back their DEI disclosures, wiped that off of every single disclosure they've had in the last couple of years just to not use the words and not be too nervous. You see a lot of companies Even if they have climate targets, not talking about them, or if they did talk about carbon neutrality the last year, not talking about them. There's are especially if you serve the government. I know one. I talked to one publicly traded, very large security software company the other day. Their ESG team was rebranded to like an internal corporate affairs team. They're still measuring emissions. They're still a huge carbon offset buyer. They still have internal targets. They just pulled every report away because they do a ton of business with the government and they don't want to be in trouble. I'm curious less about like, and I don't know if you're even able to or allowed to like dissociate yourself from your role as a regulator. So maybe this is an unfair question, but like in the political environment, does does this create risks for does disclosing these climate issues create unwanted risks for companies?
Yeah, I definitely started hearing that when I took this job on a couple of months ago. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been so open to, feedback that we should be providing more guidance and why we were so open to kind of developing like this minimum checklist is we definitely heard, like, we don't want to do more than our competitor. We want to do the right level of information, but what right is can vary, so there was a lot of consternation about that. So we definitely took that. And that's one of the reasons, again, why we're trying to develop this minimum checklist. And so we can all be working off of the same thing. There's a lot of options, in 261 for which framework you use. Um, and I think some companies will want to do more, some may not. But if we're all working off of the same information, which is, hey, this is the minimum of what CARB's looking for, hopefully that is helpful in quelling some of this anxiety.
Yeah. I think I see a lot of clients doing what I call being aggressively average, meaning they're working really, 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 really hard to disclose right in the middle of their peers. They definitely don't want to be the worst because that's not a good look. And they certainly don't want to be the most out there because that could put them in trouble. So they jump through all these hoops to benchmark against all these companies, pull out this word, add this word, turn the sentence on its head. Maybe that's fine. I'm not making a comment on that, but people are working really, really hard to do that. I think, as with everything, you will find some companies lean in to be leaders here. So, some companies, for example, on climate risk, if you are a telco, if you're a real estate company, if you're a company that really cares about employee health and safety, um, if you're huge disasters, was it last year, around the healthcare industry that destroyed IV fluid factories in North Carolina, or other drug factories around the country. Like if you're that kind of company, leaning into climate resilience is maybe very strategic. And you say, whatever the political moment, if all we're talking about is our strategy around being resilient to natural disasters today and in the future, you could phrase that as a fairly removed from politics conversation that just says, we think natural disasters could be problematic. We do this, that, and the other thing about it. Call us if you have questions. And if you are not in those categories and you are the kind of company that thinks it'll create problems for you to, dare I say, use the word climate in a disclosure, all right, like be aggressively average. If you want to be aggressively below average, that's fine. Maybe your investors don't care. Maybe they do. You know your investors fairly well. I think that what I keep hearing from Carbon, this is, you said this earlier, um, the law around 261 was pretty clear. The date was clear. 500 million was clear. Doing business in was like not hard. Like so many companies are like hanging on these words, and I know so many companies who haven't started this work yet, honestly, because they're like, oh, but I'm waiting for the definition of $500 million. I'm like, you're in. I don't know. Like you're in. You're probably in. And if you're not in, just do it. Like it's not that hard here. Like the requests around emissions is maybe like 10% harder, but like the requests are not. But it's also billion-dollar companies that have to do that. The minimum viable effort here on the first pass is not rocket science. Beehive makes it easier, but even without Beehive, not rocket science. Um, uh, a question about like the way they upload reports. So Michelle asked, will you review annual impact or ESG reports? If like TCFD is often added as an appendix in that report, or do you prefer that companies upload a specific TCFD standalone index to their website and to your database?
If your report's capturing, this checklist information or it's capturing some expanded version of TCFD or IFRS and that's built into a bigger report. If that's the thing you upload to your website and give us a link to it, nobody is going to fault you for uploading more rather than less. So no, you don't have to break it out separately.
So if this is pages 117 through
Yeah.
101 of your report, you can upload the full
Don't
thing.
forget, this is CARB. We love data, we love reports, we love information. Like it's a good thing.
And then more. Sean asked a question about is CARB having conversations with legislators or regulators in other jurisdictions. You talked about that. I know Senator Weiner and maybe Stern as well met with a bunch of the regulators from Europe, from Australia, from other countries. What are those conversations like? Like, what are you learning? Where is California trying something new versus following someone else? Who do you admire and like who's doing interesting work that you're learning from internationally?
Yeah, oh, great question. Yeah, we've had some great conversations with Japan, Australia, the EU. Um, and it's been great because I'm talking to kind of my equivalents in those arenas, so less in the political landscape, more in the like policymaker, implementer landscape. And so, kind of taking their lessons learned and learning why they've structured their programs in certain ways has been helpful. One thing that I've learned that puts CARB in a slightly different situation than a lot of the other entities that have implemented these regulations internationally is that a lot of times, just given the structure, the structure of these different entities, the folks who are implementing it are both kind of like CARB plus a tax entity, which I'm kind of jealous of because then I think you can navigate issues like
Have the
revenue
you
and
have the
doing
real.
business a little bit, yeah, a little bit easier. Whereas we, need to kind of seek information and data from like other sister agencies. We're not like the all-in entities that exist, kind of internationally. So it's been really great to learn from them and great to see these programs up and running. And also, we're just trying to make sure that we're streamlining, doing what's right by California stakeholders who, continue to care about issues like climate change and our investors, but also really help companies make sure that you can, leverage all the good reporting that you're doing already.
Yeah. And some countries, I've been calling this Australia Week, because somehow or another, I think I have 5 calls with Australian companies this week. They just call me all at the same time. And what's interesting about ASSB in Australia, it is a very much more strict in the very first implementation of this than California. So y'all be
Mhm.
grateful that we got California, not Australia. Very high penalties, quantification required either as a dollar value or as a percentage of your total revenue, must be part of financial statements. Like the reporting obligations are very, very high there. So if you want to look to where this is going, and again, I think helpfully a lot of this stuff globally is aligning around IFRS. Even the original law from 2 years ago, um, smartly wrote that like the report you need to publish is a TCFD aligned or any successor there too, because like
Mhm.
after that TCFD was disbanded or adopted by IFRS, whatever. Like
Mhm.
the IFRS is not a like hippie climate change policy organization. It is an accounting bureau. And so it'll take a minute, but like they're standardizing this stuff like a 10K gets standardized. And my personal hope for where something like a climate risk disclosure goes, certainly carbon emissions, and maybe carbon emissions are somewhat there, but climate risks currently are all over the place. Everyone answers different parts of the TCFD. Some have long narratives, some have lots of numbers, some have percentages, some have like it's just all over the place. And where this needs to go as much as possible is to be close to as standardized as a 10K, where an investor knows where they'll find the information that they're looking for, what
Mhm.
format it's going to take, what standards you went under to get those numbers or information, and they can compare apples to apples as well as possible. And that process will take time, but is I think hopefully aligning globally. And you guys like California and all the other countries say like if you already have a report that does this, just use that report. Like if you've already done this at the parent level or if you've done this for another jurisdiction, like feel free to use that report. It's not no one's trying to trick anybody into over reporting. I know how much you guys love over reporting, but nevertheless.
I don't mind, but
Um, Ulysses asked a good question about how can you explain how these letters or how these comment letters are being handled? Which is a good question. Like I left a comment 2 months ago after the report after the webinar. Did you read it? Do you remember my comment?
Mm,
Uh, how did how do the comments get processed? Who reads
mm.
them? What do you do with them? Do you read every one? Do you dismiss some as you don't have to answer this, but like, hey, that's a crazy loony. We're gonna all laugh at that one in the office over coffee, or like, do you take them all seriously?
Well, I think the good news about this program is that the folks who seem to be, responding to our ask for comments do seem to be vast majority, like upper echelon, really in this stuff, the way this group seems to be, and really, really knowledgeable. So I would say vast majority of comment letters, super helpful. Our process for comment letters generally, so, right now we have a docket open, we're seeking feedback on, a lot of the material that we put out during our last webinar. And the way we process them is we go through them as a team. We try to review. We try to look for helpful information, that will help refine our thinking, particularly as we're drilling down on things like definition or, hey, do we need to put out another FAQ to clarify something else that maybe we thought was clear but isn't actually clear. And so we try to compile, that into different buckets where then we'll take action on them. I think at this point in time, probably the most useful comment letters to us are letters that, would propose, would put forward, regulatory language proposals. Like we had a comment earlier about, has CARB considered, this specific definition of revenue? And so comments like that put into the form of, hey, this is what draft regulatory text might look like. Those definitely start to have a higher and higher impact, as we're going along in the program. I think part of that question is like, do you respond to each comment letter? No, we don't. We take it, basically we take the information, try to process it, and then, try to create different buckets of where we're using them and where we're applying them in action.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, Erica asked a question about if qualitative is okay for the first year and you're not required to do scenario assessment if this is new to you. Do you expect to, over time, up the standards? And does that come out as like you'll issue, in a year, you'll issue a thing of like, thank you everybody for submitting. We reviewed this. For the next disclosure that is due, please include like improve it in these ways. You must do scenario analysis, you must quantify, whatever. Like, do you think that'll happen? And if it does, do you expect to up that standard in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years?
Mhm. Um, yeah, great question, Erica. So I think you included a not sure yet option, which I appreciate. I would say not sure yet, but just to put a finer point around it, I think we're all curious as a team to see what comes in this first year of reporting and to see what information, that we can glean and what folks are finding, most useful. I fully expect that both 261 and 253 in implementation, that these programs will grow and change over time and evolve and probably get more and more sophisticated. But the ways in which these programs grow, evolve, or get more sophisticated, I don't have, a specific answer for that yet. I think a lot of it kind of depends on, hey, what are we seeing? What kind of feedback are we getting from investors and stakeholders, and what might be useful, for future reporting requirements, whether that's upping the game in terms of scenario analysis or something else. Hard to say right now.
You're not going to just predict the future for us, tell us how to
I
prepare.
mean, I want to, but
It'd be super helpful if you can.
it's just up to your friend Sydney. I would definitely have my druthers, but
That's fair. Um, Asheen asked kind of an interesting question. I wonder how much you can say about this. Asheen wrote that state governments have been described as the crucible of democracy. Do you think that this California law could form the basis of federal law under a new administration that takes climate responsibility seriously? Is any of your implementation of 261 informed by the thought of how it might scale up that early?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I think just kind of taking this in reverse order, I think right now, given that the SEC is not moving forward with similar regulations, we're definitely looking to try to fill that gap. And you see this oftentimes at the subnational level. You see, states like California or New York, stepping up to try to fill gaps where they're needed. So, I think this legislation came at a really good time to be able to do that. That's probably about as far as I can take that one. And then, of course, we're always trying to find ways to streamline our program. So, oftentimes California's programs are replicated elsewhere. I think right now we're in the interesting position of also trying to learn from other jurisdictions that have adopted similar regulations. So, both trying to follow and lead at the same time is an interesting spot to be in.
Yeah. Talk a little about, I mean, other states picked up on this like immediately, basically after the Trump administration took office. New York, Illinois, Colorado, I'm sure I'm missing a couple, maybe Minnesota and Washington, all put forward different versions. Some took a carbon emissions only version, some took a climate risk version. Um, what's your relationship been like with the carbs in those states? How close are you collaborating? How much are they looking to see how this first year goes before doing something similar? And would doing something similar in New York or Colorado be superfluous, or would it be helpful to those states?
Yeah, well, if they, they obviously think it will be helpful. And I think the nice thing about working at the state level is that there's so many entities and forums that have been set up to help facilitate multi-state interactions and conversations. So we have a variety of ways that we interact with the other cities and other states who are working on similar programs. So, conversations between states and coordination and collaboration is kind of a constant overarching theme in our lives. And that goes for a variety of programs that we work on, mobile sources, stationary sources, now this program. Yeah.
Um, what are things going to look like after January 1st? So January 1st happens, 100% of companies comply because they are
Yeah.
so they freaking love you.
Yeah.
Uh, besides drowning in champagne, what do we do the next day?
Yeah, so next step is, we do have a whole, thanks to the leadership of the legislature, we do have a section that will be dedicated to, communications. And so that group will be looking at the reports, and trying to pull out different themes or different threads that are, prevalent or useful. And then we'll start putting out, information, kind of summary information regarding these reports, just demonstrating what we're seeing.
And this summary information will be like, here's the number of companies, here are the industries that disclose, here's like some interesting findings across this group of 5,000 or whatever companies, stuff like that.
I think that's a fair assumption. I'm taking notes so I can remember to tell the team to do all those things. But
Um, Random question, but I guess all these are kind of random questions. How, if at all, are you allowed to use AI in doing some of this work? I imagine there could be so many interesting, useful ways where AI can like
oh,
review quality, come back with summaries, find insights, whatever. Are you allowed to use AI? Or are you guys doing that?
it's a great idea. I guess this speaks to maybe I should hire like some young upstarts who know how to use these programs to help data process these
Just ask
reports.
ChatGPT, please review 5,000 disclosures. Send penalty check to Sydney Vergis at CARB. Split with
That's right.
Adriano. Yeah, yeah, for the idea.
Exactly. We're a little bit we obviously, I represent a division that also runs a lot of really market sensitive programs. And so obviously there's a wall there with respect to AI. I think you bring up an interesting point since these reports will be public, there won't be any, confidential business information. Maybe there will be some nice opportunities to optimize. All right, young people of the world, apply to be part of Sydney's group.
I mean, good thing you guys are hiring, you're filling up a team. Finally, somebody in this economy is hiring. So there's
Exactly.
one bright
Exactly.
spot. Yeah, one bright spot. Um, Actually, Mike has a question that's been on my mind too, and I don't know. He and I talked about this the other day. Very technical question. Let's say my fiscal year ends January 31st. So today, from fiscal year 25 that ended 8 months ago, I was below 500 million. Come January 31st, 2026, I am now above $500 million in revenue. Had a great year. Do I publish my first climate risk report 9 months or 11 months later on January 1st, 2027? Or do I wait until January 2028?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We've been wrestling with this as well. And not necessarily this specific question, but we've gotten similar questions that's like, okay, maybe I had a banner year because I sold a bunch of assets, but I'm going to go back to having like a normal year, which is below the $500 million threshold the next year. Like, just because I had a bump up one year, does that mean I need to be subject to it? And so I think that really goes to, not to keep going back to this trough, but to keep going back to this trough. That's one of the reasons why we're so hyper fixated on trying to get input on things like definition of revenue. Because if there's things we should consider, like maybe we take the last 3 years average of revenue, and that dictates whether or not you're subject to the upcoming reporting regulation. Those are all kind of ideas that I think fall into that bucket, and why things like boring things like the definition of revenue are like so top of mind right now. So we definitely need input on things like that, and maybe there's ways to finesse the definition and make those kinds of specific situations more clear. So last thing we want is for folks to not be sure whether they're in or out, or whether or not they should be preparing a report or not. Like, nobody wants that.
Yeah, I mean, you got another version of that of like, if I acquire a company, if I do 300 million and I acquire a company that does 300 million,
Yeah.
now together we're 600. When does
Yeah.
that clock start? Did it start
Right.
at the end of the acquisition? Did it start the last fiscal year? Did it start,
Yeah.
the following January 1st? Whatever. Those
Yeah.
are
So I guess if you hear nothing from me today, please hear, just submit a letter
all.
or an email. And if you have specific ideas about how to make this easier on yourselves, send them over. We want to make it easy too. We just need ideas about kind of how to refine those definitions to help fit these circumstances in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. You do an amazing job, like being everywhere to talk about this. It's clear, to be very open about this. It's super refreshing and very appreciated. Um, are you going to be at a place like New York Climate Week? Do you go to all the climate events? Like, how much do you participate in the climate universe
Thanks.
outside of this job?
I personally, I try to participate in as many things as I can, because I think these conversations are so important. Like, the questions that are coming up today are so useful in informing my thinking, and I bring back to the team, and then they start thinking about it. So even if I'm being non-specific in my responses today, like, I really value these conversations, because we want to put out a regulation that makes sense. That's ultimate goal. So I do try to be everywhere. Thank you for noticing. We are sending our chair to New York Climate Week. So Chair Randolph will be there. So if you all want to rub shoulders with the chair of Air Resources Board, keep your eyes out.
The big wig.
Big wig.
But you're staying in California. You're not
Yeah, I'll
coming.
be staying here. Yeah. So if you have local things you want me to talk out during that time, I'll be here.
In the last couple minutes here to wrap this up, I'm curious if you can pause and reflect on the last 2 years of rulemaking here. What I think is interesting, speaking on behalf of the corporate sustainability universe, and I posted this on LinkedIn, I think yesterday, regulations are a big reason we have jobs.
Mm,
Many of us have jobs because our companies say, well, I got to follow the law and I need somebody to
mm,
help follow the law. And that's wonderful. It's not the reason we got into this world. We got into this climate
mm.
universe to either make a dent in climate change if you're on the decarbonization side, or focus on adaptation, resilience, safety if you are on that side of the universe. Some companies care about that and do act on those notes, and some don't. Some just get inspired by the law. Now, what I think is really interesting about laws like this is that they are that first required step. And for climate risk, which is what I know a little bit better, many companies, maybe half companies or more, are going to phone it in. They're going to
Mm.
just click the buttons, get a report done. Great, moving on. But for many, many other companies, this is going to be the first step to really think about adaptation and resilience in the face of natural disasters that are getting worse and more damaging. And so when I see
Yeah.
the work that you're doing and see the conversations that are happening around these laws and see that there is a group of companies that are either looking at this for the first time, or they've been dealing with the effects of natural disasters for many, many, many years, but
Yeah.
it's been haphazard, and now they're actually formalizing it for the first time, which is maybe even better. Like this, in my universe, is an incredibly helpful way for people who want to act on climate related issues to incentivize corporate dollars and corporate actions to go towards that. That's the best case scenario here. When you reflect on the last 2 years and what you're trying to accomplish, and not speaking about the legislation, but about the regulation that you're doing, like how do you feel about the work that you're doing, about what it could mean for people whose jobs and interests fight for climate related issues?
Love the way you're talking about it. I never quite thought about it that way before, but I'm finding it kind of inspiring. I mean, kind of kudos to, Senator Weiner and Stern for seeing an opportunity and shifting that Overton window, ever so slightly or ever so more open to recognize the importance of the work in this space. So I think you raise a really, really nice point there. The thing I will say, just in terms of, the having meaningful jobs in this space, that one of the things that I'm really grateful for is how many really smart folks with really great backgrounds have been attracted to working on this specific program. I mean, there's so many people that are coming from other kind of, I'd say, flagship programs at CARB who are even lateraling over to be a part of this effort because they really see it as the potential future of the agency. And I do too. I mean, I came over to work on this program specifically. So I think there's huge, huge potential here, huge opportunity for, growth and transparency, and shifting that Overton window a little bit. So
There we go. Sydney, thank you so much.
thanks so
It's
much.
incredible to spend this time with you. We really, really appreciate the work you're doing behind the scenes. It's incredibly helpful to all of us that you're also giving time to be as transparent as you are. So huge thank you. Really appreciate you and your whole team. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Just a note, we do this every single Thursday at 2 p.m. Next week, we're speaking with Brianna Hardy from Bureau Veritas, who's one of the larger assurance firms. So if you need to get assurance on something like 253, that'll be a good conversation. Um, we have a networking hour on September 11th. If you want to meet other practitioners, on the 18th, I'm doing a Beehive product demo. And then if you are in New York on September 24th, we are having a party. So you're welcome to come and join us. I'll send you an email about all that. Recording will be shared to Jesse, who just asked. And thank you very much, Sydney.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. Bye all.